This is the Colors Attractor mini workflow. So if you look closely at the pattern that we have within our paving area here, you can see that there is some relationship between these two pieces of geometry that we have in our paving area and the color gradients that are being generated. And we'll shift to a different type of paver output in order to see this a little bit more clearly. And you can see that this geometry here of this curve and this point are generating gradients that are emanating from those particular pieces of geometry, creating an attractor piece of geometry for the color gradients that we are trying to manipulate here. The great part about this is that wherever this geometry exists, it's going to adhere the initial color and create a gradient from that color away from this geometry until it reaches a certain distance at which it will remain the third color. So this zone being far enough away from both of these geometry to where we only have the third color swatch being utilized. So what kind of geometry can we utilize here, and how can we manipulate how this particular gradients are represented? The first is controlling the actual distances that these gradients are creating. And this can be done using the Attractor settings here in the Grasshopper RCP panel here on the side, where you have the minimum distance and maximum distance for the attraction. So if we were to slide the minimum distance up, you will notice that the first swatch color is expanding its reach. So the minimum distance indicates the distance between the geometry and the beginning of the next color that we have in our paver colors. The maximum distance controls the distance from the geometry to the third color that we have in our swatches. So the distance from here to where the color transitions fully to the third swatch, indicating a roughly 13-foot distance, which is roughly the distance that you're seeing here. The wonderful part about this is playing around with these to get the particular type of gradient that you want, but also any type of geometry that you place in the color attractors is going to create this type of gradient. So if I were to generate a surface in here and delete maybe this point, it's going to create a gradient, and since this is a solid piece of geometry, it's going to read the distances from every part of this solid geometry, indicating now that we have a filled color within this surface. And then as it goes further away from the edge of this surface, it creates that gradient back. Similarly, we can create interesting gradients with curves that are not filled in. So the geometry itself, the curve, has the attraction, but since the middle of this curve is not a piece of geometry, it's going to create gradients in and out of this particular paving area. And you can have meshes or any other types of geometry that you want, including copying in your paving area to create a full gradient within your paving area. One thing that is quite lovely about the attractor is that it's not just a distance in plan view, but it's also a distance that can be controlled in 3D space. So the distance of this geometry to the actual pavers themselves is what generates the gradient. So as I move one side of this curve up, it's creating a much different type of gradient relative to the distance from this curve as it moves away from the pavers. So if we wanted to create some sort of really interesting type of gradient that moves across this entire paving area, but varies across the paving area based on the distance in 3D space, we can control that, where we can create these sort of subtle gaps in the first swatch coloring. So what does this look like in the Grasshopper? As we open it up, you'll see the familiar beginning of the Grasshopper paving workflow with your geometry pipeline, your creating of your area, you're adding your pattern to the area where you're controlling all the different elements that make up the pattern and the paver dimensions themselves and orientations. You're trimming your pavers to your paving area, and then you're adding your color rule before feeding it into your draw area pattern component, which feeds in the colors that you're using as well. But down here, connected to the add color rule component, is our Attractor color rule, which allows us to input all types of geometry that we want. So you can use the geometry pipeline to limit what types of geometry will work. Or in this case, we are including points, curves, breps, and meshes, and all the types of geometry that you could potentially use as an Attractor geometry. And then down here, we have our minimum distance controls and our maximum distance controls as sliders.